Hello everyone, today is April 2nd. April 2nd is B, so today we're going to be talking about bias. Now bias is a very basic sewing concept, but it's very, very important. So let's learn a little bit about it, shall we? Now in order to understand bias, you first have to understand grain. Grain has a lot to do with how fabric is woven. So when they weave fabric, they take a whole lot of threads. They line them all up on a loom, and then they take another thread and weave it back and forth through those other threads. The sides formed are called the selvage. It's right there. And you need to know the orientation of the selvage to figure out the grain of a fabric. Now I'm showing you on this plaid because it's very easy to tell where the threads are on a plaid. So I have an illustration for you. Now first, the threads that go up and down across the loom are called the straight of grain. They go parallel to the selvage from one cut edge of the fabric to the other. Now there's another grain on fabric. It's called the cross grain. It goes from selvage to selvage, and it's where that thread wove back and forth in between the straight of grain threads. Now bias technically is any range of cutting that's not on the straight of grain or cross grain. But when we talk about bias, usually we're talking about true bias, which is an exact 45-degree angle between the cross grain and the grain. Now that we know about bias, let's learn a little bit about bias tape, which is our real subject today. Now bias tape is just a strip of fabric that's cut on the true bias of a fabric. It's used for binding seams, binding hems, making trims, lots of different stuff. Now you can always purchase bias tape if you would like. It comes in packages that look like this. They're usually 3 yards to a package. And what you get is a piece of cotton that has been ironed into bias tape. Now, there are a couple different kinds. This one here is what's known as single fold bias tape. You can see it is just the edges folded into the center. And this is what's known as double fold bias tape. What happens is the edges are folded into the center, and then it's folded in half again and ironed closed. As you can tell, when I put this paper in here, one edge is always just slightly longer than the other. That's important for when you sew it. You want to put the slightly longer edge on the bottom so that your stitching on the top is sure to catch both sides. Now if you don't want to buy bias tape, it is super easy to make bias tape. You'll just need a few tools. First is a self-healing mat. Now this one is huge, but you don't need one this big, just as big as you can afford. Next you'll need some kind of ruler. I prefer the clear ones, and again, longer is better, but it doesn't need to be longer than your mat. Next you'll need a rotary cutter. And finally, you'll need fabric to make your bias tape out of. First you take your fabric that you want to make your bias tape out of, and you press it. It needs to be pretty flat and free of wrinkles in order to get good bias tape. Next you take one corner where the selvage is and fold it over to the cut edge to make a big triangle. And because this triangle is so big, I'm going to fold that in half one more time. Now, these edges need to match up really, really closely. So I'm going to use my ruler, and I like to just slide my ruler up and pinch them together so that I can see just how close they are to being right on top of each other. Next, I'm going to straighten it out. I want to line up this fold with this line on my cutting board. There we go. That's pretty good. Next you need to figure out what size bias tape you want. I'm going to go for 1-inch bias tape, which will end up with 1/2 inch of finished product because you have to fold it twice. So we're going to cut 1-inch bias tape. I'm going to move my ruler down 1 inch, and with my rotary cutter I'm just going to run it across. Separate it. See, there are always a few little spots that don't get cut. I don't know if that's because I'm bad at the rotary cutter, or maybe I need a new blade, who knows. But there you go. And here's my bias tape. It's pretty straight. It's perfectly on the bias, and it's 2 inches wide, so I can go ahead and press both sides into the center, and then press it in half, and I'll have perfect bias tape. Now that you've made bias tape, you have it to use for many different things, like binding a seam, or even binding the bottom of a corset, which, by the way, is what we're going to learn about tomorrow. C is going to be corsetry, so I hope you come back, and I hope you enjoyed this video.